Okay. So thanks everyone for joining. We might have a couple people trickle in, but this is the final advisory committee meeting for the housing strategy project. And I think that's all I'm going to say before I hand it over to Matt and Kate.
All right. Thanks, Taylor. Can everybody hear me okay, both in the room and on the screen? Yeah, I see some thumbs up out there. Cool. All right. So Kate is going to share a PowerPoint. I think that there's a reasonable chance we will not need the full 2 hours that we scheduled for this meeting. But we'll see. We'll see how talkative everybody is or how much time we spend on some of these items. So maybe go to the next slide there. Just kind of as a status report, we met with all of you and talked through a number of weeks ago, or I guess it's probably been like 5 weeks or something, talked through a number of specific issues related to the proposed development code amendments that we plan to take forward, and just generally the various housing strategies that we've been talking about. Then based on that conversation, we made some refinements to some things. City staff had already had some individual conversations, individual and small group conversations with city councilors to get their take on the strategies and relative support for them. We went back and talked to council and planning commission as a group. I think we had most of the councilors there, but not all of them. The mayor wasn't there. We had I think 3 planning commissioners is my recollection. Had a good discussion. There were a number of some of the folks there raised some concerns and questions about a number of the strategies. Not all of them. Some of them people thought, yep, that generally makes sense. Although, in some cases they said, hey, we sort of reserve the right to discuss this further, of course, as we move forward. But there were a few things in particular where we sort of took a look back and tried to come up with some solutions to address the issues that were raised in that council and planning commission meeting. And so that's part of what we want to spend some time talking to you about today. We're not going to go through the full list of strategies or the full list of questions we talked about last time. We've got 3 or maybe 4, I think 3 things we're going to talk about specifically. Get your take on those. Do the solutions we've come up with make sense? Sound reasonable to you all? And then we're going to review the draft comprehensive plan policy amendments that we've prepared and get your take on those. See if you have any questions, comments, or suggested substantive changes or addition to those. And so we'll spend some time walking through those. And it's not a ton of information and that you got in advance of the meeting, but we'll walk through those during the meeting. And then just kind of wrap up in next steps. Our next steps, just to give you a preview, will be to go to the Planning Commission and then the council for adoption of several things: the housing needs analysis work that we've done, updated narrative and policies for the comprehensive plan, and then a number of amendments to the city's development code. So we have hearings with Planning Commission and Council tentatively scheduled. We'll talk about the timeline for that at the end of the meeting here. But that's kind of where we head next. So does that make sense? Sound okay? Any questions just about the agenda?
Sounds good.
All right, awesome. So moving forward. So one of the strategies we talked about and issues we talked about where there was a fair bit of discussion with the council, and we had a fair bit of discussion with you all about this at our last technical advisory committee meeting, was this idea of adding some language to the comprehensive plan that talks about policy support, general policy support for future zone changes that property owners might apply for to essentially upzone their property from lower density to medium or higher density residential use. And so you might remember that, in the kind of original strategies, when we talked about this, we said, hey, the city should think about moving forward and doing this. After some of the discussion, both with the council and you, and also some of what we heard at the community meeting, we kind of changed up our approach here, and we suggested that rather than recommending the city move forward and rezone properties, we recommend that we develop some policy language that says, hey, if property owners come forward voluntarily and want to rezone land, again, from a lower to a higher density residential designation, there would be some policy language in the comprehensive plan that would be supportive of that. The applicant would still have to go through the process and meet the approval criteria for a zone change. So this wouldn't just totally give blanket pre-approval to them. It would essentially establish some supportive policy language. And it's something that, frankly, staff and the applicant could use to say, hey, there is some policy language in the comprehensive plan that provides some general support for this rezoning, but they'd still have to show that they were meeting and being consistent with the city's approval criteria for zone changes. So that was kind of where we were when we talked to the council. When the council looked at the maps we had that showed the types of areas that we were talking about, they were a little concerned about kind of the extent of the areas we were showing. And particularly, we had talked about potentially just in this policy language, talking about areas in proximity to both existing higher density designations, but also various types of services and facilities, such as, we had said, such as schools, parks, et cetera. And we'd drawn some buffer sort of borders around some of those facilities. And one of the concerns we heard was, wow, that's a lot of areas. And do we really want to say that just because a property is across the street from a school or a park, that we think it just makes sense, at least at some level, to rezone that property? So our potential solution would be to kind of take a step back in terms of the areas that we're identifying in the map. And again, these are maps that would be used as essentially a technical resource, but not adopted as a zoning overlay or something like that. Because to some degree, these things would change over time. You'd have the information to update the maps. We wouldn't adopt these as overlay zones, but they'd be a technical piece of information. So what we're suggesting is removing the areas that are around parks and schools as part of that geography that we show on these maps. And we also might want to update the policy language. We'll get to that a little later in the meeting to reflect that change as well. So basically zero in on the areas that are proximate to higher density or mixed use zoning designations and or transit stops. That's kind of what we're suggesting here. So on the left, you see kind of the previous map that showed larger areas. On the right, you see an updated map that's not showing stuff around parks and schools. So our question to you is, does that make sense? Do you think that's a reasonable approach to addressing the comments that we heard from the council and just, some of the discussion we had previously? So that was a lot of talking to explain this one. The other ones might not take quite as long, but yeah, what do you think? Does that make sense?
My question was, what was the concern about having higher density closer to schools and parks? What was the concern there?
I think the concern was that was just kind of like overreaching or going too far, or that's maybe not enough of a reason to say, as a city policy, we tend to generally support a rezone application for those areas simply because they're across the street from or within a quarter mile of a school or a park, as opposed to also being closer to other types of services and facilities. So, I mean, that's as much as I can really articulate. I wasn't the one that raised the concern. I don't know if anybody else has any more to add. Taylor or Kate?
Well, I would just add that I think we tried to make it clear that this isn't sort of the only way to go through the rezoning process. I mean, it's not just parcels that are within those kind of buffer areas that would potentially qualify for a rezone. It's just that those are the areas that the city is kind of giving the sort of predetermined like thumbs up. These are potentially eligible sites. But I mean, a site next to a park could also meet the city's criteria for a rezone. It's just not necessarily shown on the map. And we tried to communicate that to the city council. And I think they understood that, but yeah, Matt's right. It was really more of a concern about just sort of the scope of the potential locations that would be sort of pre-qualified.
Yeah, I think that it was, it seemed very invasive into like all of the R1 neighborhoods. When it goes around the schools and the parks, it just included so much of, this looks much more conservative along the areas that might be, you know, that are higher density anyway. And the other one, it seemed like it was like pushing out into the R1 neighborhoods more. And I think there was also a concern about, well, what if somebody wants to, what if we end up with R1, R3 or R2, whatever it would go to, and then you know, just kind of have a spattering of a mix, which is kind of what we're going for. But would the people who had bought homes in a single family residence type of a neighborhood, would they be uncomfortable with that? Was that kind of potentially one of the concerns also?
Yeah, I think that's a fair description of some of the comments we heard.
And for the most part, it probably wouldn't play out to be in the real world anything that would be a negative, I don't think. But the potential and the look of it was, it seemed like it was not holding tight enough to the reins, maybe. I think that's maybe what the concern was. So what do you think about this revised strategy? Tara, I see Tara's online there.
Tara, Tim, I'm not sure who's in the room.
I think it looks great. And, you know, having been in that meeting, I think sometimes just seeing a bunch of spots on things circled on a map, it just kind of spooked people a little bit. And, you know, maybe this is going to be a bit more digestible. And like Kate said, this doesn't mean these are the only areas that are going to, you know, to be eligible for zoning change. So I think this is great. This is easier for people to look at and adjust to, and it's a good compromise.
All right, thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts one way or the other?
Denise, did you have? So in the room here, we have Denise, Carrie, Ann Johnson, and then staff.
Okay.
So, yeah. No other comments though? I think that's a good compromise.
Okay. And I'm generally going to assume that if somebody doesn't say they disagree with something, they're either neutral or they support it. That may not be totally fair, but I'm going to tell you it right now. So maybe that makes it fair.
So speak up, right?
So speak up.
If you have
something. And,
silent.
yeah, exactly. I do often take silence for acquiescence or something like that. Okay. So we'll go with this in terms of this one. All right. So kind of the next thing where there was some discussion and some concern. So we talked about generally some development code updates to facilitate development of what we call, missing middle housing. So duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, cottage clusters. And so there's a number of different proposed amendments to the development code to support this. So one is permitting some of those types of uses outright in single family zones, but with some limitations, particularly in the R1 zone, to limit that to 4 units. So it's not a large development of those types of homes in the R1 zone in particular. We also have recommended reducing lot sizes and parking ratios to make those types of housing more financially feasible to build. I think part of the reason you have not seen some of these forms of housing is just the lot sizes make it always a more profitable choice to build a single family detached home in some of these zones in particular. So I think generally folks were supportive of this, but there was a comment about, hey, do we run the risk of having somebody come in with a really large subdivision or development that's kind of all cottage clusters or all triplexes or whatever that might be? I think that from our perspective, from a market standpoint, we don't think that's very likely to happen because partly, when you look at what types of housing has been built and where the market demand is in Estacada, you're going to continue to see some pretty high demand for more traditional single family detached housing. And when we did the housing needs analysis, we didn't show that there was sort of a need/demand for like 80% middle housing. We showed a demand for somewhere in the sort of 20 to 30% range. So don't think it's super likely, but at the same time, we did come up with some potential ideas around addressing the concerns. So kind of this slide. So a couple of things we talked about. One would be to limit the amount or the percentage of land, particularly in the R1 zone, that could be developed with a single middle housing type, and that might be, somebody comes up with a subdivision, they've got a mix of housing types within the subdivision. You limit the percentage of the land or units developed for middle housing types to somewhere around maybe 20 to 30%. You might want to let it be a little higher for smaller developments, a little lower for larger developments. So that's one solution. The second one would be simply to limit the size of middle housing development in that zone, limit it to 2 acres or something like that. So those are a couple ways we think would be reasonable to address that concern, to the extent that that were to come to pass in terms of future development applications. So same general question here. Does that make sense to you? Do you think it's a good idea to add some of those types of limitations into the development code amendments that we're looking at here?
Yeah, Matt, is there going to be just a really, really good definition of middle housing?
Yeah.
In the code? Okay.
The code will define, yes, there will be your definitions will get updated in a number of cases to define each type of middle housing. So duplex, triplex, quadplex, et cetera. And then also to have a definition of middle housing that describes those things. Generally,
Okay.
When we're talking about these things in the code, we're actually talking about the specific forms of middle housing because the standards for them vary. What's required for a duplex or allowed for a duplex is a little different than what's allowed for a cottage cluster. So, but yes, the short answer is yes.
Yeah, this will work as long as staff has very clear direction on what middle housing means to apply to this. So, yeah.
I also like the first option better because sometimes developments come in and they'll be like, okay, we have a 2-acre development, so it can be all middle housing. And then that gets approved. And then next door, you have another 2-acre development. And maybe they want to do that all in middle housing. Whereas if you have a percentage, then you're going to have in each development that comes in, you'll kind of have a spattering of middle housing interspersed in there maybe. But it seems to fit what the priority was more.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't think it would be likely that would happen, where they continue to build middle housing, and if they did, I mean, people would live in it if they could sell it. It seems like a good deal too, but maybe in the R1 zone to limit it, those percentages sound fine. Anybody want to weigh in on percentages or a different take on that?
I think they look fine.
Okay.
So with the zone changes, we're gonna have standards for the middle housing and it's gonna be classified. So some subdivision that has already been approved, they would be able to have some middle housing if they met the requirements, right?
Yeah, they would be able to come in and redevelop individual lots, either redevelop or develop lots that have not yet been developed.
Right.
For
And so I don't know, are we already to parking? Because I had a question about it, the reduce off-street parking.
well, not quite, but we're getting there.
Okay, I'll
Yeah,
wait and ask.
that is one of the other ones we want to talk about with y'all, is the parking. Yeah.
Gotcha.
All right. So anybody else on this one? Sounds like it's generally making sense to folks.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you. So parking, I thought we were going to get to this soon. So, yeah. So in terms of parking, couple of things. One, we've talked about in the proposed ordinance amendments, reducing parking requirements for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. And there was generally, I think, support for that. We didn't hear a lot of concerns about the standards there. We were potentially proposing to reduce the either reduce the parking standard for common wall or townhouses, or allow for an on-street parking space to count towards it. So keep it at 2 spaces per unit, but allow an on-street space to count towards one of the 2 spaces. So that if you've got, and there's some standards around that, you'd have to have enough space in front of the dwelling to actually park a car there. So if and it would have to be on a street. I think we had some language about it being on a street that was improved. So there are some limitations on that. It's not just, oh yeah, you get an on-street credit no matter what or where. But there was, so people were generally, I think, supportive of the recommendations that we came in with, but there was definitely some concern about how is this going to impact on-street parking and circulation on local streets, especially streets that might be built to a narrower width. And so, if you've got a street that's fairly narrow where if you've got cars parked on both sides of the street, it's difficult. You don't have enough space for 2 cars to pass each other between those parked cars. There was some concern about that, and just generally about, is this going to increase the demand for spaces along the street? Particularly in response to the concerns about impacts on narrower streets, one potential solution would be to say, hey, you can only use that on-street credit for 1 of your 2 spaces for a townhouse, again, or common wall dwelling, if the street's wide enough. In this case, we're suggesting 36 feet wide. So it's wide enough to accommodate cars parked on each side and to essentially space for 2 cars to travel, in one in each direction. So that was our recommendation. Kind of keep the reductions in off-street parking requirements, but tweak it to only allow for the on-street credit on those wider streets. So, and I don't know, Denise, if that was.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I really like this. I think this is a great compromise. But my point was, so for those subdivisions that have been approved already and only have a 32-foot wide street, they couldn't add middle house, or they could add it, but they wouldn't get the credit for the on-street parking. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Yep.
You
I
say
think
that
that's a
it's-
great compromise, the
Well, it's
36
only-
feet.
Sorry. Only the common wall dwelling. So any apartment like condo kind of things is the only thing that this restricts, or that the 2 space requirement applies to?
Yeah, in terms of the 2 spaces, it also applies to, I think you right now still require 2 spaces for single family detached. And we're not proposing changing that. So you already
Right.
require 2 spaces for single family detached. We didn't propose any changes to that. We ultimately ended up with requiring 2 spaces for common wall or row houses. but allowing for the on-street credit. This would just change that.
Yeah.
And then you already have a reduced requirement for multifamily, and we had recommended reducing the number required for plexes, essentially.
Right.
So like a duplex would have 3 spots and a
3 per
triplex has 4 and a fourplex has 4. Is that what?
I think fourplex actually they're recommending to change to 5
Mhm.
because currently our code
Lumps that in with the
kind of,
apartment.
contradicts itself. And so you could consider a fourplex currently as multifamily, and multifamily only requires 1 space per unit. So sort of funnily right now, a triplex would require 6 spaces, I think, and a fourplex would only require 4.
Yeah.
So
So a duplex
Trying
would
to kind of
require,
even things out a little for the plexes.
so they require, like a duplex requires 3, triplex requires 4, fourplex requires 5. And then if it's common wall, 2 per unit, unless they can park on the street.
Correct.
Yep. Well,
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. You have a concern?
Cool. Awesome. And again, I'm going to assume everybody else who haven't spoken thinks it's probably all right. So
Yep.
That might have been our only kind of 3 things where those were the things where, again, we kind of heard enough concern from council or planning commission where we felt like, we should come up with some tweaks to these things to address those things. So I don't know if anybody had any other comments, concerns. I think it doesn't hurt to kind of just see if you have anything on any of the other stuff before we move on and talk about the comp plan amendments. But we didn't have anything else to bring to you around the other development code provisions or strategies, because we'd had a good conversation with y'all last time around and felt pretty good about where we landed, and just wanted to, come back to you on those things where we had the council concern express. So anything else you may want to weigh in on before we talk about policies?
Nope, I think we're good. Thank you for coming up with those solutions. I think those will be well received.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now we will talk about the comprehensive plan amendments. So just kind of a couple things. One, in addition to the policy amendments, we've identified some updated narrative to go into your comp plan as well, that essentially just summarizes some of the findings and results of the housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory work that we did. So we're not, if you have any comments on that stuff, I would say just, send them to us, but we didn't want to kind of walk through like 5 pages of mostly factual information. We wanted to focus on, frankly, the updates to the policies, because that's really kind of where the rubber hits the road, because those policies are used when you're looking at, for instance, I can't remember for sure, but I think a number of some of your land use planning approval criteria have to do with consistency of comprehensive plan policies. Most cities do. So it's important that you've got policies that support the things that you want to support. So there's a number of things that we always kind of, as a firm, look at when we're looking at a city's comprehensive plan and the policies related to housing in the comp plan. We take a look at it kind of from these perspectives. One, that you got policies that support creating a wide range of housing options, housing that can come at very, different price points and rents, and meet the needs of different types of households. It's important to further fair housing goals. That's like legally you're required to do that. And we think it's important to have some policy language in your comp plan that talks about that. Supporting collaboration at a regional level, we think is a good idea. And I don't want to say even more so, but maybe even more so, partnerships with nonprofits and others, because cities alone cannot meet all of that, you don't control the housing market. You're not the ones that are actually building the housing. You really need to work with and support the folks who are out there doing that. So we think it's a good idea to have some language around partnerships, particularly as it relates to building housing for low and moderate income households, because that's where the most intervention tends to be needed. We've got this language in here around that we talked about earlier, encouraging voluntary rezoning in areas near transit services and near high density zones. So we'll show you that specific policy language and ask you a question in a minute about it. And then there are some policies right now in your comp plan that are about things that you've either already done or there are more actions. And so we would recommend removing some of those. You don't need to have something in there that you've already done. It's good, I think, to have some things in there that are consistent with what your code allows, because they provide sort of the policy underpinning for your development code provisions. But if they're more of an action and they're an action you've already undertaken, or they're very specific to an individual location, we tend not to recommend including those. So this is just kind of an overview, and then we'll kind of walk through the individual policy amendments and summarize those in the next couple of slides. And I think we'll do them kind of a slide at a time and then get your opinions on them. And there's 3 slides. You'll see a bunch of red lines. Yeah, so we'll see what you think. So.
Matt, can I ask a question real quick before we go?
Yeah.
And maybe this is just your, what do you think type question. So our population, in 2010, we had a population from the Portland state, the PSU population.
Yep.
And we were really disappointed with the 2010 census because it was about 500 less than what PSU said we had. So we had to backtrack. So you can see that from 2000 to 2010, it says the census said we didn't even gain 400 people, yet we gained, over 400 housing units. And so is the 2020 census numbers out?
Yeah, so the 2020 census numbers are out.
I noticed it doesn't show them in here.
Yeah, because we did the actual housing needs analysis work before they were, well, let's see. I'm not sure if we did it before they were out. This is a complicated.
Okay, just my question is, you don't have to tell us because I know that's technical. So you have the 2021 PSU number here.
Yeah.
Was that close to what the census number was?
It was relatively close. So I'm going to do my best
Okay.
to sort of tell you what I think the situation was in terms of the relationship between the projections, the census, what kind of growth you've seen, what kind of growth you might see in the future.
Mhm.
And we had a bunch of discussion on that topic back when we were looking at that part of the project,
Right.
housing needs projections. So my recollection was that they were relatively close, but that the PSU numbers were potentially undercounting your population in relationship to the amount of growth you'd seen. And our also feeling was that the PSU projections, the projected growth rate was a little bit on the low side too, compared to what we might expect to see moving forward. And so unfortunately, for good or ill, cities are required to plan for growth using those PSU projections. They get updated now every 4 years. It used to be 3, now it's every 4. And when PSU does that, you have the chance to talk to them and, advocate for some changes to what they're proposing if you, think that they're off. But they've already adopted the 2021 projections. So our hands are tied a little bit in terms of projecting that growth. So recognizing though that you all, and I think we all, felt like the projections were somewhat undercounted, we did some alternative projections, assuming a higher rate of growth. And we then compared what that might look like to your supply of land along with the official projections. And what we generally found was that land supply is not the issue for you. You would have to grow at a much faster rate than what PSU projected to actually run out of residential land. And that's really the sort of main issue with the projections. If the projections are are really off, you grow a lot faster, you have a limited supply of land, you can potentially run out of land sooner, that's problematic. We didn't find that to be the case. And so I think that while it's an issue in terms of the numbers having some problems, it doesn't affect the bottom line, which is that
Okay.
you have an adequate supply of land to support your projected future housing needs, even if you grow more quickly, and even if we started at a more accurate point in terms of the base population level.
Okay.
So I think that I don't want to say don't worry about it, but I would say you've got enough time between now and the next set of projections coming out to where you've got a good cushion. When the next set of projections come out, I would really advocate for you guys to pay pretty close attention to those and to have some good, clear discussions with PSU about what they're projecting at that time. And then they will have had a chance to update their estimates to reflect the 2020 census if they had not already done that. So you'll be able to address that issue at that time as well. So I think that, yeah, they're not perfect. But I also think that it's not, in your case, a huge issue in terms of moving forward within the either the 20-year horizon, but particularly the shorter term.
So are you saying PSU certifies theirs every 4 years or 3 years or whatever it is?
Well, so they do two things. They do new estimates every year, but
Yeah, that's
the projections. So they do estimates for the current year every year.
okay.
When they get to where the census has been approved, the census is out, then the next year they'll reflect those when they do their estimates for the following. So
because I think we're already at 5,200 now. The new year said.
So they'll adjust.
53.
So they will adjust their estimates. The more important thing is really kind of the future. Well, I don't know if it's the more important thing, but in planning for, the as important thing is the rates, and those they update the projections and the rates of growth every 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Well, we're over 5,000 because we can't apply for SCA grants anymore. So darn it.
So that's I told you it would be a long explanation or answer on that.
That's okay.
That's
Thank
where
you.
Yeah, no worries. So so we're just going to again walk through these a slide at a time. I think we've got 3 or 4 slides of these. I'm not going to read these, but I'm just going to tell you, okay, here's generally the types of changes we're recommending to this subset of policies. So I talked about the sort of policy language around encouraging a variety of housing types and densities and at price ranges. That's what this first policy is doing. We tend not to recommend including very specific numbers, even if your housing need identified pretty specific numbers. We just suggest you sort of have some policy language around being consistent with your most recently adopted HNA, and that way you don't have to change that policy every time that changes. So that's kind of what this first one is around. The second is really around providing a kind of a wider range of housing choices and explicitly identifying what those different types of housing are. So that again, there's sort of that policy foundation in your plan for your code, allowing for those different types of housing. The policy we recommend deleting is something that was an older policy that either has been implemented or is no longer current. And then number 3 down here is I talked about kind of having some policy language around planning for regional housing needs. So we've got some language there about coordinating with Clackamas County on that. And it's just kind of updating some language that was already in there, but it's being a little more specific about who you're coordinating with. So I'll stop. I'll pause at the end of each of these slides and just see if anybody has any comments on them or thinks, yep, those look good. Let's talk about the other ones.
Those look good. Yeah, I feel like good.
Okay. So sounds good. We'll go to the next one, and yeah, just speak up, when we take a little pause here. So some of this I've already talked about, suggested that you have some language in your comp plan about further supporting the Fair Housing Act, affirmatively furthering fair housing goals. And then we have kind of tweaked some of the language around manufactured homes or mobile homes, partly just to be kind of consistent with what the terminology that's used now and kind of what the state says about this. So that's what that language is about. We didn't make any changes to previous policy 7 other than renumbering, or 9. We did get rid of policy 8 because it was an action that I think is already undertaken. So it doesn't need to remain in your comp plan. So those were the changes to that set. Those look okay.
Yep, looks good.
Okay.
We are, one thought, we are coming to the end of the Downtown Urban Renewal Agency, but we still have just a few more years. Is it okay? I mean, that kind of makes it sound like it's gonna go on forever, but is it all right for now?
Yeah, it might be all right for now. You know, and I don't know what your plans are in terms of, I mean, yeah, so you're kind of coming to the end of that. I would have presumed you wouldn't, it's not a thing you would sort of extend. We could just add some more qualifying language around, you know, while in place, or, you know, through the term of the urban renewal time period. I'm not going to get the right words today, but.
And that even after the Urban Renewal Agency sunsets, that we would want to somehow.
You still want to do these things.
Could
Yeah.
we just remove the reference to the URA and just make that policy say encourage the adaptive reuse of, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
Do you think that would?
I think
that'd be good.
Because then it's, you know, that's something that like the city can also do maybe in other
Mhm.
ways that
Right,
might be
true.
unrelated to
Yeah.
the agency.
Should we leave the public-private partnerships, or should we just encourage the adaptive reuse? Blah, blah, blah.
Encourage the adaptive reuse, et cetera.
I mean, we have other language, policy language around public-private partnerships, or partnering with other groups and agencies. I
Or like
think-
the Main Street, that Main Street grant that did the Broadway building, that was an urban renewal, but that was a public-private partnership. It took both. So yeah, maybe we could leave that.
Well, he's saying he has it in other
And,
parts.
oh, in other parts of it.
Yeah.
I think it's
Okay.
fine either way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you think
Yeah.
it's important, particularly to call it out here, I think it's okay to keep it, and we can just reword it accordingly. I think it's also okay to just make it nice and simple and say, hey, encourage this type of development.
Mhm.
We could also list public-private partnerships as an example of a way to encourage
Mhm.
that type of redevelopment.
Mhm.
Goes through and other means, you know.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Good thought. All righty. So here we've got one we tweaked and several we added. Here we actually did take out some of the language around, well, we didn't take it out, but we kind of expanded the language. So we said, instead of just through the urban renewal agency and grant programs, we said encourage, and we added maintenance and restoration of existing housing, especially affordable housing stock. And then we said through, this is kind of similar to what we talked about doing in the previous policy there, through programs such as, you know, urban renewal, tax abatements or rebates, other financial incentives. So it doesn't kind of tie your hands to any one thing, but it provides some examples around. And then the next one is the language around expanding partnerships with nonprofit housing developers and others, particularly around, you know, low and moderate income housing units, first-time home ownership, other vulnerable homeowners. So there's that language. And then we've got some language around encouraging development within the UGB, consistent with what is in your housing needs analysis. So there again, we're kind of making that tie back to the work that's already been done and will be, presumably updated in the future. So you'll kind of continue to have that. And then number 13 is the one we talked about earlier, around encouraging voluntary rezoning. And so I guess our question here is, we had this language that said proximate to other sites zoned for high density or to services such as transit lines, schools, parks, libraries in the downtown zone. And given the conversation with the council and the potential changes to those maps we talked about, we wonder if we should not include schools, parks, and libraries in the policy language. So there's sort of consistency between what we said we'd show on the maps and what we say in this policy language. So that's a question for y'all. Do we want to tweak this to just say such as transit lines and the downtown zone?
Maybe I wasn't paying good attention, so apologies, but I didn't realize that libraries was included in that concern. And I definitely think of the library. I mean, we just have the one library here. But I definitely think about that as like a great and important resource for people with limited resources. And so if we're thinking about where, more affordable types of housing are going to be potentially located and wanting services to be accessible for people without cars, I would include libraries as one of those services. I would leave that in this policy, but that's just me.
Maybe just take out schools and parks.
Right, yeah.
How does that sound to folks? Keep libraries, take out schools.
I would agree with that.
And the library is already in that area
in
that
that,
we're.
Right, so maybe that's
So,
a moot
yeah.
point anyway.
But yeah, I think it's good to leave it in there and.
Maybe we'll get another library
Never
someday.
know.
Yeah, never
Could
know.
happen.
All right, and does the rest of that policy language on this slide look okay to y'all?
Mhm.
All right, everything else?
I
on-
think so.
Okay, cool. All right. And then in your comprehensive plan, you have policies, and then you have a section in each chapter that says implementation. And so these are more actions. And so you didn't have, I think, too many in here under housing. You had one that was just, very basic around zoning. It had said the city will enforce the zoning ordinance. We're recommending that you add some language around not just enforcing it, but also updating it periodically. We said every 3 to 6 years or needed to meet the housing needs, identifying the comp plan, and then you also will consistently implement and enforce it. So we kept the enforcement language in, but we also added some update language. No change to number 2. Number 3 talks about monitoring that supply of buildable land. So this kind of gets back to what we talked about earlier around the population projections, that you want to be keeping an eye on the amount of developable land you have, buildable land you have, not waiting 20 years, to go back and take a look at that. We suggested some language around updating that inventory approximately every 8 years. I can't remember if we'd had much discussion about kind of that time frame, but that's the time frame that the state uses for jurisdictions that meet a certain threshold and are required to do this. So cities above a certain size are required to update their buildable lands inventories and housing needs analysis every 8 years, 6 years if they're even larger. You're not required to do that, but we think it won't. We do recommend some policy language around doing this periodically, and often we're asked to specify a number of years. So sometimes we hesitate to do that, but in this case, there's some precedent for the 8 years, and we said approximately to give you a little wiggle room there. So that's a lot of talk, but that's what number 3 is about. And then because there's language in the housing needs analysis report about specific strategies, a number of which are related to your development code and which you will be potentially implementing if you adopt the code amendments we talked about here. We added an item about continuing to implement the strategies that are needed to address housing needs. But we've got some caveat language about as staffing and monetary resources allow, so that you're not sort of, somebody doesn't hit you over the head too much with, hey, you didn't do exactly this thing this year. It is going to depend on what kind of resources you have in terms of money and staffing to do. There's a lot of things in there, and it's important to make progress on them, but also not to say, well, you really have to do every one of these things all the time. So we've got that language in there too for implementation. So I think I said more words than were on the screen, but I figured it was, kind of giving you my take on them. So
He gets paid by the word.
Rich woman.
that would be terrible, man, for others if I got paid by the word.
Boy.
Yeah, you couldn't afford our services if that were
No,
the case.
Really
We're
true.
getting a good deal. Yeah.
No, I think I've told you, maybe I haven't, that one of my wife's nicknames for me is Chatty Matty. So yeah, Kate's right.
I think that looks good. And I kind of appreciate putting the years in there approximately, because maybe we'll get better at it, but we kind of tend to run slow. So if we know it says 8 years, then maybe we'll get close to that versus not saying something or saying 15 years. And then it's like,
But we never had a planning staff before either.
we never did have planning staff. So we'll be on top of it now.
Now
There
there's
you
a whole
go.
bunch of us.
Yeah.
I know, it's pretty awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. So couple of tweaks to a couple of these policies, but otherwise it seems like most of them are in good shape. So we will move forward and update those things. We'll update the draft code amendments. And so kind of couple of next steps kind of on consultant and staff side. One is to do that, finalize, and I say finalize, but it's really finalize what's going to be taken forward into the adoption process, the code and plan amendments. And you all will need to send a draft of this information to the state. That has to happen. I think you're all probably pretty familiar with this. That happens 35 days in advance of the first public hearing. And the first public hearing with the Planning Commission is tentatively scheduled for late August. I think it's August 25th.
August 25th.
Got it right. Sweet. So that means July 20th, which is next week, that stuff will need to go out to the state. So we'll help you get it ready to go. So that's kind of next up. Same thing in terms of any changes we may need to make to the housing needs analysis report and the housing strategies report. We'll tweak those and then get ready for those adoption hearings. So August 25th for the Planning Commission. And Taylor, remind me of the date for the council. That one I don't have in my
I
brain.
think we were tentatively looking at end of September. It would be Monday, September 26th. So that
Perfect.
there was a full month between the two hearings,
Yeah.
just in case there were, revisions or changes that we needed to incorporate.
And that's great also because I have just semi-locked in some vacation time in the first half of September. So
Nice.
that's not all about me, but still good for me to be able to be there if I can. So that's what's coming up. I would just say thank you everybody for sticking with us at all these meetings and with all the stuff we've thrown at you. It's been much appreciated and it always results in a much better product. So we really appreciate all your time and effort throughout the process. And I would also say that, if you have other comments on this stuff, even though we send stuff to the state in about a week and we've got the planning commission hearing in late August, if there's stuff we need to tweak, there's still time to tweak it before it goes out. So if you have specific comments, let us know. There's not a lot of time before it goes to the state, but the stuff that goes to the state, there's always this sort of understanding at their end that things are going to change by the time it gets to, or often will change by the time it gets to the planning commission. So do let us know, just, where to find Taylor, and she knows where to find me. So, yeah, or maybe where to find Alan, and Alan knows where to find Taylor.
Yeah, send it all to Alan.
Well, Matt, I wanted to say thanks because I'm not going to be watching those council meetings or anything. And so I want to say thanks because I know it's been a long process, but I think it's a great, the results are really good. And I appreciate your patience with some of the people you've had to deal with. So thank you for the job you did on this. It's great.
Yeah, our pleasure. Absolutely. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
agree, because I think that we've gone back and forth. I think it's been a very educational process too, while we're working on this. So I think that's been helpful. You've had to make a lot of revisions, and I mean, sometimes we ask questions and then we get answers, and then the next time we get different answers from similar people. And so, but I think it's because we're all working through this and trying to figure out, what's going to be the best in the years to come. So I think that everybody's learned a lot too.
Yeah.
At least I have.
Yeah, totally understandable. And I always say really kudos to Kate, because she's doing,
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah.
My pleasure. And I was just going to give a plug for those of you who might be interested in participating in the hearings. If you do want to testify on behalf of the TAC and show your support and maybe describe, why you support certain strategies in particular, I think that is always really beneficial to hear from folks who have been, participating in the process and represent the community, especially if there are, concerns from decision makers or, public testimony in opposition to the recommendations. So
Yeah,
we'll
I would
plug that.
totally echo that. Yeah. And let's see, when we're done, Taylor, do you have time? Because it looks like we might finish early. Do you have time for like a quick follow-up with
Yeah.
us?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
just to talk about timing of kind of what we send you and timing and format of what we send you, that'd be great. We could either we stay on this, or you can send us a.
I'll send you a new Zoom link so that we can use
Cool.
a regular laptop.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, so thanks everybody, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good words, and yeah, and I'm sorry we won't see you, Denise, at the hearings. But,
I might listen in. Who knows?
there you go. All right, well, thanks.
All right,
everybody.
thank you.
All right, thanks,
Cool.
Kate, Maddie.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
It'll be nice to have this.